how do we flourish as leaders under unrelenting pressure? How do we flourish as leaders under unrelenting pressure? And we put this one with challenge 1 because it's different, but it is closely related. So remember Jesus talks about in Matthew 24 about these are the beginning of birth pangs. He's referring to the last days. And birth pangs, if you've been around a woman having birth pangs, when the first one comes and the second one comes, the third, you don't know if you're in the third or you're in the 400th. Like you don't know like where it is in the scale of things. But the moment will come when, boom, Jesus says there'll be a new heaven and new earth. Instantly, that baby will come forth. Well, we are clearly in a season of cascading birth pangs, which seem to be coming at greater frequency for all of us. So whether it's COVID, economic shifts, racial, social justice issues, extreme political divisiveness and extremes, leadership scandals, one after the other, gender marriage issues. There's just so many crises coming our way. So it can feel very overwhelming. And there was a Gallup study that came out recently. I don't know if the three of you saw that. It was in the Washington Post, but it showed how declining the trend of people coming to church has been declining for a long time, but it's really become quite steep, even pre-COVID. So how do we flourish? Because if we're not flourishing under this pressure, and I don't think we can expect it's going to stop the pressure, the shifts are happening in our culture are really tremendous, and they're still emerging. We don't know a lot of things about what's going to be happening in the world around us, but how do we flourish? So I want to talk to you really about, and this actually is the first mark of what we would consider a discipleship that deeply changes lives, or the first mark of emotionally healthy discipleship. And it's simply this: we must deepen our ability to be before we do. It's be before we do. That theme is a big one. We didn't quite use that phrase, but it was in everything that these three were saying. And that's this. And let me define it. I believe the definition is in your PowerPoint as well as in your notes. A person who practices being before doing operates from a place of emotional and spiritual fullness. So they're deeply aware of themselves, others, and God. And as a result, their being with God is sufficient to sustain their doing for God. I think we all know, I know I have, I know these three know it as well, what it's like to be giving out of an empty cup, or feel like this is sucking something out of my life that I'm in the ministry, but it's not coming out of a well that's overflowing. And so we're talking about, how do I recognize that the greatest gift that I can bring to the people I'm leading is my being, my having an unrelenting commitment to walk with God in such a way that my doing is flowing out of a deep being with God. So let me share what it's not. Because prior to 1996, when we began this EH discipleship journey, I spent a lot of time in prayer. I had a cave in my basement. We had nights of worship, all-night prayer meetings. I was big in scripture. I would go to leadership conferences to learn. But I wasn't being, even though I was interceding a lot and praying a lot and going to a lot of prayer meetings and worship services, because I wasn't in touch with my feelings or my motives. I wasn't introspective. I didn't know about my shadow, my fears, my perfectionism, my anxieties. I was totally unaware of my genogram, my family of origin, going back 3-4 generations, and how it impacts me. I didn't do grief and loss. I didn't do feelings. I didn't know how loving people was not really high on my agenda. I mean, I wanted to love people. I assumed they felt loved because I was preaching Jesus, but I didn't know how to get at my being. So this slide on Mary Martha, which you'll see behind you, this Mary Martha dynamic, I always felt like my life was out of balance. Like you'll see on the left side, you'll see doing for God is way bigger. The balance, the scale is off, and it's way much going on. And my being with God is small, and that's definitely how I felt the first 17 years of my leadership. I just always felt overloaded. I had more to do than I could do. So the question was, how do I get those scales to the right, where my being and doing is sufficient to sustain what God's asked me to do. Now, what's interesting is that this Mary Martha passage in Luke 10 has been written about in every generation from Luke, from the first century all the way through to today in the 21st century. Bishops, apostles, popes, you name it, patriarchs have written about how do we as leaders balance our active life with our contemplative life, with our being with Jesus life. And we see this dynamic in Jesus, for example, being with the Father, going alone, Luke 5:16, to be alone with the Father, and then emerging out into the cities and do his ministry. We see he required the 12 disciples to first be with him and then to go out and preach and drive out demons. We see that Acts 6, the 12 disciples also saying, no, our priority is prayer and the word, and then we got to elect some deacons. Out of that will flow the ministry. We see in the early church developed a catechumenate. When persecutions were coming on the church, a lot of people were leaving, quitting the church and denying Christ. They lapsed, as they were called in the early centuries. And so the early church realized they too had a shallow discipleship crisis, just like we do. And they developed what's called the catechumenate, a way of really discipling people so their being with God was sufficient to handle the pressures that were coming the way against the church. And actually, the leading figures in the early church, the first 500-600 years, were called the doctors of the church. They were bishops, they were leaders in cities, they were theologians, but they were first monks. We forget that. They weren't CEOs, they didn't have an MBA from leading universities of how to build organizations. They were prayers. They were men and women in Scripture, and they led from that place. They were being with God, out of which they did their ministry. So we're called to be contemplative activists. That's why I say we're active. In fact, Thomas Aquinas wrote about the most difficult calling in life is to be a person who is a contemplative with God, a being with God, yet active, involved in the world for Jesus, leading. That balance chart is the most difficult to do, being and doing. So let's not underestimate the challenge it is to flourish under unrelenting pressure. So I'm going to give you 4 kind of, invitations. I think are God's invitations to us, so we can be before we do. The first is this, that we've got to make a radical decision. I like to compare it to the Desert Fathers in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. When the church became part of the Roman Empire, became legal, everybody was going to church, but there was such a shallowness to the discipleship that you could not distinguish the world from the church. And then emerged what we call desert mothers and fathers who began to flee to the desert to get to God, get cleansed of their idols, so they could eventually bring salvation to the church and the world. But they made a radical decision to leave everything and go to the desert. I think we all must make a radical decision to say there is nothing more important in my leadership and in my life than to be with God. Now, we're not going to a literal desert, but I've got to create some rhythms and structures so that I am like a desert mother and father. I've got a desert place out of which I am with God, I'm with myself, and I'm getting cleansed by God of the idolatries inside of me so I actually can offer something to the world. But when I say radical decision, because what we're talking about here is not a program, it's not a quick fix. We're talking about a radical shift in the way that we lead and follow Jesus. COVID and all that's happening in the culture right now, I believe are gifts to us as the church to get free from an Americanized Christianity and by God's grace get to something more historic, more deep, more broad, more biblical, that we actually can raise up pastors and leaders for the next generation. So the first is you and myself making a radical decision and staying with that for the rest of our lives. The second is to feel our feelings. And to feel our feelings. In other words, like David in the Psalms, and we talked about Gen Z earlier, fully alive. I didn't do feelings for a variety of reasons. We don't do feelings, especially difficult feelings in the church, like sadness and fear and anger. We're nice. We do Christian nice. We don't take the time to let ourselves feel and be human. For self-reflection. It's frightening, actually. As someone said to me recently, a pastor, if I go down this road, Pete, I'm I'm afraid of what I might discover, the monsters living inside. But actually, the Desert Fathers and Mothers, if you read their literature closely, they weren't just heavenly minded, they were quite earthly minded. And I love this one. They were very much struggling with their motives, with their shadows, with their less than pure motives. Evagrius, one of the Desert Fathers, he summarized it best. He was asked, you want to know God? First know yourself. In other words, the pathway to God inevitably passes through self-knowledge. And so whether you look at Scripture, whether it's Jeremiah's depression or Job's ranting or David's suicide, but it's asking questions like, why am I always in a hurry? Why am I so anxious? Why am I so angry? Why am I avoidant of that person who's mad at me? And why was I so uncomfortable in that conversation yesterday? But it's getting in touch with what's going on inside of us, not being so busy that I don't have time for that, because God's in reality, and God lives in us, and he wants to meet us there. And but if we fail to feel our feelings, we miss many opportunities to hear God and what he's saying to us, and we end up living in an illusion. So this slowing down to feel involves a lot of practices, right? Everything from whether it's going to meeting with a friend, journaling, counseling, mentors. It's just taking the time and work to be in touch with your interior world and what you're feeling. But we listen to God from the inside. I didn't do that for the first 17 years of my life, but it was a revolution. So I make a radical decision. I feel my feelings. And thirdly, I integrate silence. And without going deeply into silence, I would say it this way. Without silence as a core spiritual practice and solitude, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to grow into spiritual maturity. These are core spiritual practices like Bible study and prayer. We're not saved by them, we're saved by Jesus alone. But silence is, especially in the noisy world in which we live, is core. Integrating silence, not set times of silence alone, say in your morning, midday, evening prayers. I'm talking about just having pauses in your day. I've now begun to take a few pauses in silence, even now before I speak to people, just to be present before I even start. And then finally, or fourthly, it's just my final thing is a commitment to commune with God all my waking hours. In other words, that my life, again, we're back to success, is to commune with Jesus, not only in my devotions or morning or midday or evening prayer, but like right now, I'm talking to you and you're listening. We're in this event together, but I'm aware of God's presence. I'm remembering God. I'm communing with him. I drove into New York City traffic getting here. I couldn't believe it. I said, what happened? Everybody's out. But to be in traffic, and yet I was seeking to remain in communion with Jesus. That's my life. So how do we flourish under unrelenting pressure? Obviously, you're going to hear this over and over again. It's slowing down, my life. And so that means adjusting your job description. That your number one, I don't know what your job is, volunteer or paid. Your number one job is to grow as a disciple, and that means being with Jesus. Like that's, I know for 10 years, I don't even think it's on our job descriptions at New Life anymore, but it was for the first 10 years when we got in this journey. We put it on everybody's job description because we said we want to make sure it's really clear. We've got to make this switch that we're going to be before we do. I don't need it on my job description anymore and I know New Life, it's so much part of the culture, but that adjustment, I believe, needs to be made. We talk about things like a rule of life, developing a rule of life, practicing Sabbath delights, getting wise mentors who are ahead of us to grow us in the journey. And just you'll see in your handouts, there's some team transformational videos that are available for free on our website on how do I grow in practicing Sabbath delight or genogram your family or crafting a rule of life. And we'd encourage you, at some point after this live stream event, get started on be before I do. And these are kind of like 1 to 2 hour exercises. We lead you through the integration of some practices that will enable you to be before you do.